My name is Emily Walker. I'm 34 years old, and if there's one thing people have always known about me, it's that I've never been afraid of hard work. I grew up in southern Minnesota, surrounded by farms, gravel roads, and endless fields that seemed to stretch all the way to the horizon. While most of my friends dreamed about moving into the city and buying modern homes in quiet subdivisions, I dreamed about something completely different. I wanted land. Not just a few acres, real land. The kind where you could walk for half an hour without reaching your property line. The kind where mornings began with birds instead of traffic. The kind where I could build a home exactly the way I imagined it. For years, that dream stayed just that, a dream. I worked long hours as a project manager for a construction company in Minneapolis. I saved every bonus, skipped expensive vacations, drove the same pickup long after most people would have traded it in, and slowly built enough savings for one goal: buying my own property. 3 years ago, I finally did it. I purchased 80 acres of farmland just outside my hometown. To most people, it probably looked like an ordinary piece of farmland. To me, it was the beginning of everything I'd worked toward since my early 20s. I already knew exactly where I wanted my future home. Not near the road, not where everyone driving by could see it. I wanted it tucked deep into the back of the property, surrounded by trees, with enough privacy that I could sit on my porch at sunset and hear nothing except the wind moving through the fields. There was only one challenge: getting there. The future driveway would need to stretch almost half a mile from the county road to the house site. That wasn't something I could build overnight. It would take months of planning, heavy equipment, truckloads of gravel, drainage work. Everything had to be prepared long before construction on the house ever began. Fortunately, planning construction projects was literally my job, so every weekend I'd drive down from Minneapolis to work on my own project. Dad usually met me there. He lived next to the property, and helping me build my dream home quickly became our favourite weekend tradition. We walked the fields together, measured elevations, marked the future yard with bright orange survey flags, stretched fluorescent twine between wooden stakes. We even hired a contractor to begin shaping the driveway. 10 truckloads of gravel had already been delivered. The roadbed had been crowned properly, so rainwater would drain off both sides. It wasn't finished, but anyone with functioning eyes could tell exactly where the driveway was supposed to be. Looking back now, I realised that driveway would become the centre of everything, because one man looked at all that work and decided the rules simply didn't apply to him. The previous owners had rented the farmland to the same local farmer for years. A few days after I closed on the property, that farmer showed up. His name was Rick Donovan, at least, that's the name I'll use. The first thing Rick said wasn't congratulations, it wasn't welcome to the neighbourhood, it wasn't even hello. He climbed out of his dusty green pickup, looked across my fields and asked, "So, I'm farming this again this year, right?" Not, "Would you consider renting it to me?" Not, "Can we discuss a lease?" He said it like the decision had already been made. I smiled politely. "I'm open to renting it. We just need to work out the details." Rick immediately offered me the same rent he'd been paying the previous owners. I already knew what farmland in the area was renting for. His offer was almost 30% below market value. I thanked him, then declined. He frowned. "That's what the old owners charged." "I understand. But I'm not the old owners." He raised the offer slightly. Still too low. Again. I politely declined. The negotiation went back and forth for nearly 20 minutes. Eventually, we settled on $70 an acre. It wasn't quite the full market rate, but it was fair. I thought we had reached an agreement. Then I told him there were 3 conditions. I pointed toward the survey stakes in the distance. First, I'm building my house back there, so nothing gets planted inside the future yard. Rick nodded. No problem. I pointed toward the long strip of freshly shaped gravel. Second, nothing gets planted on the driveway. Again, he nodded. Fine. Then I looked directly at him. Third, I'm putting up a pole barn before winter, so I need the field beside the driveway completely cleared before December 1st. This time, he hesitated. That's earlier than most people harvest. I know, but construction is already scheduled. He stared across the property for several seconds before finally saying, "Fine." We shook hands. Most people probably would have stopped there. I didn't. Working in construction had taught me one simple lesson. If it's important, put it in writing. That evening, I typed up a straightforward lease agreement, nothing complicated, just the rental amount, the payment schedule, and the 3 conditions we'd discussed. When Rick came over to sign it, he grumbled through almost every page. "Seems like a lot of paperwork." I smiled. "It protects both of us." After another minute of complaining, he signed. So did I. We each took a copy. Driving back to Minneapolis that evening, I felt relieved. The land would earn a little income while I prepared for construction. Rick could continue farming. Everything seemed settled. At least, until my phone rang less than 2 weeks later. It was Dad. The moment I answered, I could hear the frustration in his voice. "Emily, you'd better sit down." My heart immediately sank. "What happened?" There was a long pause. Then he said the last thing I ever expected to hear. "That farmer just ploughed straight through your brand new driveway." For a few seconds, I honestly thought Dad had to be mistaken. My driveway? Yeah. He ploughed straight through it. I stood frozen in my apartment kitchen, gripping my phone a little tighter. "Dad, are you sure?" I walked the whole thing myself. He planted corn right across it. I slowly sat down at the table, trying to picture what he was describing. It didn't make sense. The driveway wasn't just a line on a survey map anymore, it was visible. The contractor had already shaped the roadbed. The centre had been raised for drainage. 10 truckloads of fresh gravel had been spread across the entire length. Even from the county road, anyone could clearly tell exactly where the driveway was supposed to be. There was no way someone could accidentally miss it. Unless they weren't trying to. Dad sighed. "And that's not all." My stomach tightened. "What else happened?" "He drove right through the area you marked for your future yard." I closed my eyes. Just 2 weekends earlier, Dad and I had spent nearly an entire afternoon laying everything out. We measured where the front porch would face. We marked where the flower beds would go. We flagged the future septic system. Even the large oak tree I wanted to keep had been tied with bright orange ribbon so contractors would know to protect it. There were dozens of survey stakes. Bright fluorescent twine connected every corner. Anyone driving through that area would have seen exactly what it was. Dad continued. "The flags are gone. The twine's been ripped out. And," he hesitated again, "I think he parked his equipment on your future lawn." For a moment, I couldn't even speak. There were hundreds of acres surrounding my property, open farmland everywhere, yet somehow Rick had chosen the one area we'd specifically agreed would remain untouched. Not only that, he'd signed a contract acknowledging it. I finally asked, "Did you talk to him?" "No." "I figured I'd call you first." I took a deep breath. "I'm driving down Saturday." Dad answered almost immediately. "Don't go down there looking for a fight." "I'm not. I just want to see it with my own eyes." Saturday morning, I left Minneapolis before sunrise. The 2-hour drive felt twice as long as usual. The entire way there, I kept telling myself, maybe Dad had exaggerated. Maybe only a small section had been disturbed. Maybe the damage wasn't as bad as it sounded. The moment I pulled into Dad's driveway, I knew I'd been wrong. He simply pointed toward my property without saying a word. As we walked toward the entrance, my heart sank. The driveway had practically disappeared. Fresh rows of young corn stretched neatly across the gravel. The raised centre of the road was still faintly visible underneath the soil, but unless you already knew a driveway had been there, you would have thought it was just another part of the field. I stood there in complete disbelief. "He actually did it." Dad nodded quietly. "I told you." We walked farther down the property. The more I looked, the worse it became. Broken survey stakes lay scattered in the dirt. Pieces of bright orange twine were tangled beneath fresh tractor tracks. Several marker flags had been crushed completely flat. It looked like someone had deliberately ignored every single thing we'd spent weeks preparing. Eventually, we reached the future home site. Dad hadn't been exaggerating. Rick's equipment sat exactly where my front lawn was supposed to be. A large tractor, a planter, several attachments, all parked directly on top of freshly seeded grass. Grass I'd paid to have planted less than 2 weeks earlier. I slowly shook my head. He knew. Dad folded his arms. Emily? There is absolutely no way he didn't. There were flags everywhere. He drove over every one of them. I felt my frustration building. Not because of the money. Driveways can be repaired. Grass grows back. Survey stakes can be replaced. What bothered me was something much deeper. I'd negotiated fairly. I'd agreed to a rental price. I'd written everything into a simple contract. I'd trusted another adult to keep their word. And somehow, none of that seemed to matter. I walked back to my truck and grabbed my copy of the lease agreement. Dad put on his reading glasses while I flipped through the pages. Together, we reread the 3 conditions. No planting inside the future yard. Violated. No planting on the driveway. Violated. Field beside the driveway cleared before December 1st. That deadline was still months away, but after seeing everything else, neither of us felt very optimistic. Dad handed the contract back to me. What are you thinking? I looked across the field toward Rick's farmhouse in the distance. I could call him. You could. But honestly, I don't think it'd change anything. Dad nodded. Probably not. If someone ignores this much work, they're probably not interested in being reasonable. I folded the contract and slid it back into the folder. Then I'll let the paperwork speak for itself. At the time, neither of us realized just how important those signed pages would become. As we loaded a few leftover fence posts into Dad's trailer later that afternoon, he suddenly pointed toward the edge of the property. You notice something over there? I walked over. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then I noticed deep tractor tracks leading across an old burn pile left behind years earlier. The previous owners had demolished an abandoned outhouse decades ago. Most of the lumber had been burned, the remaining nails, twisted metal, and debris had simply been buried. Fresh tire marks ran directly across it. Dad smiled slightly. I think he drove right over that. What happened? He pointed toward a neighbour's field. I heard it took him half a day to tow the tractor out. Both rear tyres were completely flat. I looked back at the buried debris, then across the field toward Rick's parked equipment. For the first time all day, I couldn't help smiling. I didn't do that, Dad chuckled. No. He managed that all by himself. Neither of us knew it yet, but 2 flat tractor tyres would end up being the smallest problem Rick faced that year. After that weekend, I drove back to Minneapolis with a decision already made. I wasn't going to call Rick. At least, not yet. I knew exactly how that conversation would go. He'd deny everything, tell me it wasn't a big deal, maybe even blame me for putting the driveway in the wrong place. There was nothing to gain by arguing with someone who had already shown he didn't respect either my property or the contract he had signed. Instead, I decided to be patient. It wasn't easy. Every instinct I had wanted to confront him immediately, but years of managing construction projects had taught me something important. The person who stays calm usually wins. The person who loses their temper usually loses the argument. So I kept my emotions under control. And I waited. Spring turned into summer, then summer slowly became fall. Every few weeks, I'd drive the 2 hours back to my property to check on the progress of my future home. Except, there wasn't much progress to see. Instead of a gravel driveway leading toward my home site, there were rows of healthy green corn. Instead of a freshly seeded front lawn, there was farm equipment parked where my porch would eventually sit. Every visit reminded me of the same thing. Rick had broken every promise he'd made. Dad tried to keep my spirits up. We'll fix the driveway after harvest. The gravel's still underneath. He didn't steal it, he just buried it. I knew Dad was right. The damage wasn't permanent, it was repairable, but that wasn't really the point anymore. The issue wasn't the driveway, the issue was trust. I'd trusted someone with my property, and he'd treated it like it belonged to him. One evening in early September, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the lease agreement again. I wasn't looking for loopholes, I was reminding myself exactly what we'd agreed to. The payment schedule caught my attention first. The initial rent payment was supposed to have been made before planting season. I stared at that sentence for several seconds, then I checked my bank account. Nothing. Not one deposit, not one check, not one payment. I flipped through my desk drawer, looking for old mail, just in case I'd somehow missed something. Nothing. Rick hadn't paid me a single dollar. Not before planting, not during the summer, nothing. I picked up my phone and called Dad. Have you seen Rick lately? A couple of times. Has he mentioned the rent? No. What about the driveway? Nope. I leaned back in my chair. So he destroyed part of my property, planted on my driveway, parked on my future lawn, and still hasn't paid me. Dad let out a quiet sigh. I think he's hoping you won't push the issue. I think he's betting you'll just let it go. That thought bothered me more than the unpaid rent itself. It wasn't the money, it was the attitude. He seemed convinced that because I lived 2 hours away, I'd eventually stop paying attention. As October arrived, construction started becoming much more real. The contractor called to confirm our schedule. Emily, we're still on track for the first week of December. Perfect. We've already ordered the building package. Your pole barn materials are ready. As long as the site is prepared, we'll be there. After hanging up, I immediately circled December 1st on my calendar. That date wasn't random, it was the deadline written into the lease. The field beside the driveway had to be completely harvested before then. Otherwise, the construction equipment wouldn't have enough room to reach the build site. Everything depended on that deadline. The gravel deliveries, the excavation, the building crew, the utility markings. Months of planning rested on one simple promise. Remove the corn before December 1st. That was it. Nothing complicated. Just keep your word. Near the middle of November, I drove back to the property again. The moment I arrived, my heart sank. The corn stood tall, golden, ready to harvest, but not a single row had been cut. Across neighbouring farms, combines moved steadily through the fields. Truck after truck carried fresh grain toward the elevators. Harvest season was clearly underway. Just not on my property. I pulled out my phone and called Rick, straight to voicemail. I left a calm message. Hi Rick, this is Emily. I just wanted to remind you that construction begins right after December 1st. I need the field cleared by the date we agreed on. Please give me a call. I waited. Nothing. 2 days later, I called again. Straight to voicemail. Again. No response. By now, I wasn't angry. I was worried. Not because of Rick, because construction schedules don't move simply because one person decides to ignore them. Winter in Minnesota doesn't care about excuses. If snow arrived before we got the building up, the entire project could be delayed until spring. That wasn't just inconvenient, it could cost thousands of dollars. The week before Thanksgiving, I made one final attempt. I drove to Rick's farmhouse. His pickup sat in the driveway. I walked up and knocked on the front door. After a moment, a woman answered. She smiled politely. Can I help you? Hi, I'm looking for Rick. I'm sorry, he's not home. I just need him to call me. It's about the farmland he's renting. The moment I mentioned the property, her expression changed. Oh, I know what you're talking about. I explained everything calmly. The corn needs to be harvested before December 1st. My construction crew is scheduled, and I still haven't received any rent payment. She looked genuinely surprised. You haven't been paid? No. I'll make sure he knows. She sounded sincere. I thanked her, walked back to my truck, and drove away. The whole trip back to Minneapolis, I kept telling myself the same thing. Surely now he'd understand how serious this had become. Surely he'd finally call. Surely no one would risk violating a written contract when thousands of dollars in construction were only days away. I couldn't have been more wrong. Because December wasn't just going to test Rick's honesty, it was about to test whether he believed contracts actually applied to him. December 1st arrived, and just as I'd feared, nothing had changed. Dad called me before I even left for work. The corn's still standing. I closed my eyes for a moment. He hasn't shown up? No. Not yesterday. Not this morning. I looked at the calendar hanging beside my desk. December 1st. The date written in black ink on the lease agreement. Not an estimate, not a suggestion, a deadline. One that Rick himself had agreed to months earlier. I thanked Dad for the update and ended the call. For the rest of the morning, I couldn't concentrate on work. Every construction milestone I'd spent months coordinating depended on that field being empty. The building crew had already been scheduled. The gravel had already been ordered. Equipment rentals had already been paid for. Changing the date wasn't as simple as making another phone call. Entire crews had reserved those days. If we missed the window, the next available opening could be months away. The following morning, December 2nd, Dad called again. This time it's the utility company. What happened? They're marking the underground lines. That was exactly what should have been happening. Before any excavation, the electric, gas, and communication lines had to be located. Bright orange flags appeared beside the future driveway. Yellow paint marked the gas lines. Red paint marked electrical crossings. Blue paint identified the water service. Months earlier, I'd arranged every one of those appointments. Everything was moving exactly according to schedule. Everything. Except Rick. So, has he harvested anything? Dad laughed softly. Not one row. I shook my head in disbelief. He has to know construction starts this week. He knows. He just doesn't seem to care. December 3rd. The gravel trucks arrived. One after another. Massive dump trucks rolled onto the property carrying load after load of crushed rock. Dad sent me photos throughout the afternoon. Fresh piles of gravel lined the construction site. The foundation area had been measured. The building package had already been delivered. Steel beams, roof panels, wall framing, everything sat neatly stacked, waiting for the crew the following morning. I called the construction foreman that evening. We're still good for tomorrow? We'll be there around 7. Perfect. I'll see you there after I leave Minneapolis. I hung up feeling cautiously optimistic. Surely, even now, Rick would realise he had no more time left. Surely he'd move the combine, harvest the corn, do something. I went to bed hoping the next morning would finally bring some common sense. Instead, it brought another phone call. At exactly 7:12 the next morning, my phone rang. It was the construction foreman. The moment I answered, I knew something was wrong. Morning, Emily. We've got a problem. My stomach tightened. What happened? We can't get in. What do you mean? There's a combine parked sideways across your driveway. For a moment, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. My driveway? Yep. The entire entrance is blocked. Our equipment can't get past it. I slowly leaned back against my truck. Of course. Who else could it be? Only one person had both the equipment and the motivation. Rick. He hadn't just ignored the contract, he'd blocked the only entrance to my construction site. The foreman spoke again. What do you want us to do? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I opened the folder sitting on the passenger seat. Inside was the lease agreement. I'd been carrying it with me almost every day for weeks. I turned directly to the paragraph I'd practically memorized. All crops adjacent to the driveway must be harvested no later than December 1st. Today's date was December 4th, 3 days after the deadline. The rental agreement had effectively expired. The field beside the driveway, legally, should have been empty. Instead, it was still full of corn, and now a combine was blocking my property. I took a slow breath, then another. I'm not delaying construction. The foreman waited. So what do you want us to do? I looked one last time at the lease agreement, then answered calmly. Can your equipment get around the combine? There was a brief pause. It'll mean driving through part of the field. Will that get you to the build site? Yes. It'll flatten some corn. I looked back down at the contract. According to that document, there shouldn't have been any corn there in the first place. Then go around. Another pause. You sure? I'm sure. The construction starts today. Do whatever you need to do. Understood. We're moving. For the next hour, I barely touched my work. Every few minutes, I glanced at my phone. Finally, Dad texted me 3 pictures. The first showed the bulldozer leaving the county road. The second showed heavy equipment carefully crossing the edge of the cornfield. The third showed the construction crew beginning to level the pad for my future pole barn. They hadn't driven randomly across the crop. They'd taken the shortest possible route to reach the construction site. Exactly what any contractor would have done under the circumstances. A few minutes later, Dad called. They're making good progress. Any sign of Rick? Not yet. I looked out the office window toward the snow-covered streets of Minneapolis. Something told me that wasn't going to last, because sooner or later, Rick was going to drive up, see crushed rows of corn, and realize that ignoring one signed contract had just become the most expensive decision of his entire year. About 45 minutes after the construction crew started, Dad called again. This time, I didn't even have a chance to say hello. I could hear shouting through the phone, loud, angry, and getting closer. Dad pulled the phone away from his ear for a second. I think you'd better listen. Even through the speaker, I recognized the voice immediately. Rick. She was absolutely furious. I grabbed my keys. I'm leaving work. Dad answered calmly. Don't rush. The crew stopped for lunch. Nothing's happening right now. What happened? Rick just got here, and she's losing her mind. The drive back felt longer than usual. By the time I reached the property, several construction workers were standing beside their equipment, eating sandwiches and quietly watching the argument unfold. The bulldozer sat near the freshly levelled pad. The excavator was parked beside a pile of gravel. Everything had stopped, except Rick. The moment she saw my truck pull in, she marched straight toward me. Her face was bright red. What the hell is wrong with you? I calmly closed my truck door. Good afternoon, Rick. Don't good afternoon me. You destroyed my corn. She pointed wildly toward the flattened rows beside the driveway. Do you have any idea how much money you cost me? I looked across the field. The damaged section wasn't very large, just enough for the construction equipment to reach the build site. No contractor had driven around for fun. They'd taken the shortest route possible. I looked back at Rick. I've got a question. She folded her arms. What? Why was your corn still there? She blinked. What does that have to do with anything? It has everything to do with this. You agreed that field would be cleared before December 1st. She waved her hand dismissively. I was busy. I would have gotten to it. I nodded. I understand. But that's not what the contract says, she laughed sarcastically. Oh, come on. What's 3 or 4 days? For you? Maybe nothing. For me? It meant delaying a construction project I'd been planning for almost a year. She shook her head. You should have waited. I stared at her for a moment. I'm sorry? You should have waited until I harvested. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My builders were scheduled months ago. They're not going to sit around because you ignored a deadline. She pointed toward the road. My combine was parked there. I looked at the machine blocking my driveway. The combine you left across the entrance to my property? She didn't answer. Instead, she crossed her arms. You had no right to touch my crop. I walked back to my truck and reached for the manila folder I'd been carrying for months. Inside was the original lease agreement. Every page was still exactly as we'd signed it. I opened it and pointed to one paragraph. "Would you mind reading this?" Rick barely glanced at the page. "I know what it says." "Then read it." She reluctantly looked down. "Tenant agrees to remove all crops adjacent to the driveway no later than December 1st. "Thank you," I smiled politely. "And today's date?" She didn't answer. I answered for her. "December 4th. She shrugged. "So?" "So? You violated the agreement." She scoffed. That date wasn't important. "It was important enough to put into the contract." She looked me straight in the eye. "I never agreed to that." For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard her. "What?" "I never signed that contract." The construction workers stopped talking. Dad slowly turned toward me. Even he looked surprised. I couldn't help smiling. "That's your defense?" Rick shrugged confidently. "I never signed anything." Without saying another word, I pulled the original contract from the folder. Not a copy, the original. Every page initialed, every signature clearly visible. I handed it to her. She stared at it. Her expression changed almost instantly. She knew exactly what she was looking at. After several long seconds, she quietly muttered, "I don't remember signing that." I almost laughed. "You don't remember? Or you wish you hadn't?" I gently took the paperwork back. Then something occurred to me. "If you're saying you never signed a lease..." Rick frowned. "What are you talking about?" I looked across the field. "If no lease existed, then you never had permission to farm my land." She looked confused. I continued, "You've also never paid me. Not $1. So," I pointed toward the standing corn, "if you never rented the property, and you planted crops on land that wasn't yours, whose corn do you think that is?" The realization hit her all at once. Her confident expression disappeared. She opened her mouth, closed it again. For nearly 10 seconds, she couldn't think of a single thing to say. Instead, she reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out her phone, and stepped a few feet away. Dad quietly leaned toward me. "Who do you think she's calling?" I've got a feeling I know. Rick wasn't just a local farmer. She also happened to be a county commissioner. She had connections, and judging by the way she was talking into the phone, she was calling one of them. About 15 minutes later, a sheriff's patrol SUV turned onto the county road and slowly pulled into my property. Rick smiled for the first time all afternoon. "There," she pointed toward the patrol vehicle. "Let's see what the deputy thinks." I watched the SUV come to a stop. The deputy stepped out, adjusted his duty belt, then started walking toward us. At that moment, I had absolutely no idea that Rick had just made the biggest mistake of the entire dispute. Because the person she'd called to save her was about to become the person who solved the whole problem in my favour. The deputy stepped out of his SUV with the calm, professional expression of someone who'd handled 100 property disputes before. He looked at Rick first, then at me. Finally, he glanced toward the construction site, where the crew had quietly gone back to eating lunch while they waited to see what would happen. "I'm Deputy Harris," he nodded politely. "Who's the property owner?" "I am," I answered. He acknowledged me with a slight nod before turning back to Rick. "You made the call?" "I did." Rick didn't waste a second. "Deputy, she destroyed my crop. She ordered those contractors to drive straight through my field. They've caused thousands of dollars in damage." As she spoke, her voice became louder and more dramatic. She pointed toward the crushed rows of corn as though the entire harvest had been destroyed. The deputy listened without interrupting. He didn't argue. He didn't take notes. He simply let her finish. When she finally stopped talking, he turned toward me. "I'd like to hear your side." I appreciated that. Too many people make up their minds before hearing both versions of a story. Deputy Harris wasn't one of them. I walked back to my truck and retrieved the same manila folder I'd been carrying around for months. Inside were copies of everything: the signed lease, the payment schedule, construction contracts, delivery receipts for the gravel, photos Dad had taken after Rick ploughed through my driveway. I handed him the lease agreement first. "If you don't mind, please read page 3. He took his time. His eyes moved carefully down the page. Then he stopped, read one paragraph again. Finally, he looked up. "This says the tenant agreed to remove all crops adjacent to the driveway no later than December 1st. "That's correct." He glanced at his watch. "And today is December 4th. "It is?" Rick immediately interrupted. "I was only a few days late." The deputy looked at her. "A few days after a contractual deadline is still after the deadline." She crossed her arms. "She could have waited," I answered calmly. "My construction crews were scheduled months ago. The building materials had already been delivered. The utility companies had already marked underground lines. Waiting wasn't an option." The deputy slowly nodded. Then I handed him another document. "This is the payment schedule." He studied it for several seconds. "The first rent installment was due before planting season. Did you receive it?" "No." "Any part of it?" "Not $1. The deputy looked directly at Rick. "Did you pay her?" Rick hesitated. "I was going to." "But you hadn't." Silence. The deputy didn't need an answer. The silence answered for her. He walked over to the edge of the driveway and examined the combine sitting across the entrance. Then he looked at the construction site. Finally, he turned back toward us. "So let me make sure I understand." He pointed toward me. "You own the land." "Correct." "You have a signed lease." "Yes." "The lease required the field to be cleared before December 1st. "Yes." "You weren't paid." "Correct." "And your contractors couldn't reach the construction site because the tenant blocked your driveway." "Exactly." The deputy looked at Rick. "Is any of that inaccurate?" Rick shifted uncomfortably. It isn't that simple." "It usually is." He spoke calmly. "Either the contract says that, or it doesn't." Rick looked away. For the first time all afternoon, she had no argument left. The deputy slowly folded the paperwork and handed it back to me. "I think I understand what's happened here." Rick immediately stepped forward. "So you're going to make her pay for my crop?" Deputy Harris looked at her. "No." She blinked. "What?" "I'm not." Her face immediately turned red again. "How can you not?" "They destroyed it." The deputy pointed toward the lease agreement still in my hands. "No. You created this situation. You agreed to remove the crop. You didn't. You agreed to keep the driveway clear. You didn't. You failed to pay rent. You didn't." Every sentence landed harder than the last. The deputy wasn't raising his voice. He didn't need to. The facts were doing that for him. Then he surprised all of us. He smiled slightly. "You know, I actually own a combine." Both Rick and I stared at him. "I'm sorry?" "My brother and I farm together. I've harvested corn my whole life." He looked toward the remaining field, then back at me. "If you'd like, I can harvest the rest of the crop for you." For a second, I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He continued. "If Miss Donovan pays the rent she owes, I'll release the harvested corn to her. After deducting the harvesting costs and storage fees." He paused. "But if she refuses to pay, I'll simply purchase the crop from you." I blinked. "So either way, I receive the rent?" He smiled. "That's the idea." Rick looked absolutely stunned. "You can't do that." Deputy Harris shrugged. "I'm offering a practical solution. You can settle this in court if you'd rather. But personally, I think honouring the contract would be cheaper." Dad quietly leaned closer to me. "I like this deputy." I couldn't help smiling. "So do I." Rick stood there in complete silence. She looked from the deputy, to me, to the construction crew, as if she were waiting for someone to agree with her. No one did. A few seconds later, she climbed into her pickup, slammed the door, and drove away without another word. Deputy Harris handed my paperwork back with a small smile. "Sometimes, the strongest person in an argument isn't the one who shouts the loudest. It's the one who kept the paperwork. As I watched Rick disappear down the county road, I realised something. Months earlier, she'd laughed when I asked her to sign a simple lease. She called it unnecessary paperwork. Now, that same paperwork had just become the strongest protection I could have asked for. Construction finished exactly on schedule. Less than 2 weeks later, I stood inside my brand new pole barn for the very first time. Sunlight streamed through the open overhead door. The concrete floor was still spotless. Stacks of lumber lined one wall. Tools I'd been storing in Dad's garage for months finally had a place of their own. It wasn't my dream house. Not yet. But it was the first permanent structure on the property. The beginning of the future I'd been working toward for years. As I stood there looking across my land, I couldn't help thinking how close all of this had come to being delayed because one person believed the rules didn't apply to her. Deputy Harris kept his word. A few days after our meeting, he and his brother harvested the remaining corn. The grain was hauled away and stored while everyone waited to see what Rick would do. Would she finally honour the agreement, or would she force everyone into court? For several weeks, nothing happened. Christmas came and went. The snow grew deeper across the fields. Life settled into a quiet routine. Then, early in January, my phone rang. It was Deputy Harris. "I thought you'd like an update." I smiled. "I've been wondering." "Did she ever pay?" He laughed. "Oh, she paid." I leaned back in my office chair. "So it's finally over?" Almost. Apparently, Rick had shown up carrying an envelope full of cash. Along with it, she handed Deputy Harris a receipt she'd already prepared. At first glance, everything looked perfectly normal, until he noticed the date. The receipt claimed the payment had been made before the end of the previous year, several weeks before she'd actually paid. I frowned. "Why would she do that?" Deputy Harris chuckled. "I'm guessing taxes." She wanted it to look like she'd paid on time. I wasn't surprised. After everything that had happened, it fit the pattern perfectly. Ignore the rules whenever they became inconvenient. Then try to rewrite history afterward. "So what did you do?" "I handed the receipt right back." "And?" "I told her I'd sign it." The moment the date matched reality. I laughed. "How did she take that?" "About as well as you'd expect." According to Deputy Harris, Rick argued for nearly 20 minutes. She insisted the date didn't matter. She claimed everyone adjusted paperwork now and then. She even hinted that people should help each other out. Deputy Harris simply folded his arms. "I'm happy to sign, with today's date. Nothing more, nothing less." Eventually, Rick realised she wasn't going to win. She crossed out the old date, wrote the correct one, then quietly initialed the change before handing it back. Only then did Deputy Harris sign the receipt. Before hanging up, he laughed one last time. "It's funny, people who ignore contracts suddenly become very interested in paperwork when it benefits them." I thanked him again. Not just for helping resolve the dispute, but for treating both of us fairly. He hadn't taken my side because he knew me. He took the side supported by facts. That's exactly how the law should work. I assumed that was the end of the story. For several months, it was. Every weekend, Dad and I worked on the property. We planted trees along the driveway, installed fencing, started planning the foundation for the house. Little by little, the empty farmland began turning into the home I'd imagined for years. Then, one Saturday morning, Dad walked into the pole barn carrying the local newspaper. He placed it on my workbench. "You might want to read this." I looked down at the headline. It was about the county commission election, more specifically about one commissioner who wouldn't be returning, Rick Donovan. According to the article, multiple ethics complaints had been filed against her. The investigation concluded she'd repeatedly used her position for personal gain. When election day arrived, the voters had seen enough. She lost her seat, by a wide margin. I looked up at Dad. "You think any of this played a part?" He shrugged. "Maybe. Maybe not. But once people start looking closely, they usually find more than they expected." That sentence stayed with me, because it perfectly described everything that had happened. People sometimes ask me if I regret letting the contractors drive through part of that cornfield. The answer is still the same: no. Not because I enjoyed watching someone's crop get damaged. I didn't. Farming is hard work, and I respect anyone who earns an honest living from the land. What I don't respect is someone who believes a signed contract only matters when it's convenient. I never wanted revenge. I wanted to build a home. I offered a fair rental price. I wrote a simple agreement. I trusted another adult to keep her word. Rick made every decision that followed. She drove over my driveway. She ignored my survey markers. She parked equipment on my future lawn. She never paid the rent. She ignored the harvest deadline. She blocked my driveway. She denied signing the contract. She called the police, expecting them to rescue her. Instead, the paperwork told the truth. The deputy followed the facts. The construction continued. The rent was paid. And eventually, the same person who believed her position made her untouchable lost that position altogether. Today, every time I drive down that long gravel driveway toward my home, I remember the very first season I owned this land, the driveway that disappeared beneath rows of corn, the contract everyone laughed at, the deputy who trusted documents more than loud voices, and the county commissioner who discovered, far too late, that the most expensive mistake she ever made was signing a contract she never intended to honour.